This is some bonus material on Hebrews 9 about the Day of Atonement. And this is part of the Self-Taught Bible Study group over in Facebook. So if you're not a member there, you might want to go over and check that out. There's some study on the book of Hebrews happening there. And this video is meant to demonstrate some tools that can help in Bible study and how to use them together to get a better understanding of what might be going on in your Bible. Part of that Bible study for me is referencing scholars who aren't just New Testament experts, but also involving those who are experts in the Old Testament or the ancient Near East. For me, Mike Heiser is one of my go-tos because of his understanding of the ancient Near East and of Second Temple literature and his knowledge of the ancient languages. He provides what I think is a more thorough understanding of what we read in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, because he can apply a broader range of knowledge. We're going to follow some of his thinking about the Day of Atonement as it's used in Hebrew 9 and its source in Leviticus 16. So what is the Day of Atonement? Well, it's about atonement. So we need to figure out what all that means in order to apply it in the context of Hebrews 9. And if you happen to go look at Hebrews 9 verse 7, you've got the regulation of how and when the high priest can enter the inner sanctuary. And these regulations come from Leviticus 16. So we're going to take a look at Logos Bible software. And right now I'm working in the ESV version. We're going to go over to Leviticus 16 and bring that up for our use here. As an intro, to make atonement for himself, the high priest, Aaron in this case, kills a bull and sprinkles its blood on the front of something called the mercy seat, and then in front of the mercy seat. He does the same thing at the altar and elsewhere. So let's take a quick look at the regulations for dealing with not the sin of the high priest, but we'll move on to the sin of the people. We're going to do a little bit of Bible reading here in Leviticus 16 verses 6 through 10, which is this. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. So that was for him, that was for the high priest. Now we'll move to the people. Then he shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord, and the other lot for Azazel. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord, and use it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. Okay, we're going to scroll down a little bit more and continue reading in verses 15 through 22, which is all of this here, to see what else happens with this, the sins of the people. It says, then he, which be Aaron, then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering that is for the people, and bring its blood inside the veil, and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it over the mercy seat and in front of the mercy seat. Thus he shall make atonement for the holy place, because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel, and because of their transgressions, all their sins. And so he shall do for the tent of meeting, which dwells with them in the midst of the uncleanness. No one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement in the holy place until he comes out and has made atonement for himself and for his house and for all the assembly of Israel. Then he shall go out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it, and shall take some blood of the bull and some blood of the goat, and put it on the horns of the altar all around, and he shall sprinkle some blood on it with his finger 7 times, and cleanse it and consecrate it from the uncleanness of the people of Israel. And when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place, and the tent of meeting, and the altar, he shall present the live goat. And Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat, and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel, and all of their transgressions, all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the goat, and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. The goat shall bear all their iniquities on itself to a remote area, and he shall let the goat go free in the wilderness. Oh, so that's interesting. You've got these two goats on behalf of the people. The first is killed, and the blood is sprinkled in the same places as the blood of the bull for the high priest, on and in front of the mercy seat and elsewhere. Then the high priest confesses the sins of the people over this other goat and releases it into the desert or wilderness. That's the end of it. It's not killed. We're not told what happens to it. I don't know. It belongs to Azazel. You're not going to find Azazel anywhere else in the Bible, but if you've read First Enoch, you know all about him. And if you're familiar with the meaning of Jewish geography, the desert is a place of evil and chaos. So that kind of sets the scene of what's going on with this goat. So what's this mercy seat? It's the lid of the Ark of the Covenant where Moses put the tablets, the commandments that God gave him. It is thought that God would literally sit there. You have this ark in the inner sanctuary where the high priest can only go one day a year on this Day of Atonement. No one else is allowed in the temple area while this is happening. It's just the priest in a special garment making specific preparation to enter the presence of God who sits on the mercy seat. The scene reminds me kind of a bomb squad scene where we've got the perimeter set up around a bomb to keep everyone away while this specially trained technician is sent in to defuse the bomb. If there aren't any people around this sanctuary and this high priest is the only one in there and he's in the inner sanctuary, the only that he can only go into one day a year, it kind of raises the question, what's being atoned and what is the purpose of atonement? And if in my mind, if I'm stepping back for a minute and try to be aware of what I think atonement is, I think it's Jesus shedding his blood for the forgiveness of my sin. Something like, because of my sin, X or Y is required of me, but Jesus took my place and fulfilled that requirement, so now I'm okay. And that's directionally correct. What's interesting, if you start from the New Testament and you kind of work backwards, and that's what most New Testament scholars do, you start with the Greek, because that's what the New Testament's written in. It's written in Greek. And because you're working in Greek, if you need to go look at the Old Testament, you're going to refer to the Septuagint, because that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And the Septuagint's going to help you understand how to think about atonement, the mercy seat, and these sacrifices. So we're going to follow along a little bit in some thinking here and try to understand what a New Testament scholar might see, and then what perhaps an Old Testament or an ancient Near Eastern scholar might see as they're working through Hebrews 9. We're going to go over to Logos now, my Bible software, and here is my Greek Septuagint. You can see that here. It's the English translation of the Greek Septuagint. And if I look at, here we are in Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, and I've got this word mercy seat here in verse 2. Down here is something called an interlinear pane, where I get information about the words that are in the text itself. And in this case, I can see the Greek text. I can get access to a bunch of information about this word. And the word being used here is the Greek word hilasterion. So mercy seat, the word used in the Septuagint is hilasterion. We're going to see in a minute the scholars disagree on what the meaning of this word is. Now, if we're just doing Bible reading our Bibles, like none of this would matter. But because we're doing Bible study, not just Bible reading, we're going to follow this a bit and see if we can understand the disagreement and if there's a resolution that makes sense. So now we're going to move over to Michael Heiser's podcast. And he publishes transcripts of his podcast, and this is his podcast for Hebrews 9. I love the transcripts because they make it very easy to follow along. I don't have to sit and listen. I can read it all here like I would read a book, which is super, super helpful. And what else Heiser does is he refers to other scholars. So he's not making this stuff up. He's constantly pointing his listeners to other resources that can help them understand things. And here he's quoting a guy named Hagner. We're going to look at him more in just a minute. But he starts out with this quote from Hagner. The Septuagint regularly translates the noun, kipperet in the Hebrew, mercy seat, with the word hilasterion, which comes into the New Testament at two important passages of Romans 3:25 and Hebrews 9:5. Well, those are the only two places where hilasterion is found in the New Testament. So first, Heiser's quoting this guy, Hagner. And he doesn't tell us exactly which book. So we're going to see if we can figure out what Heiser is quoting exactly. So I'm gonna copy this text right here and go over to Google. I'm going to do a search on that text, and I'm going to include the word Hagner. There, so I found that, and if I scroll down a little bit, oh, that's interesting. So books.google.com, encountering the book of Hebrews, and if I click on here, it literally found the page where this quote is. So now I've got it. I can see if I then click on, let's see if I click on this X. Yeah, it'll tell me which book was it. It's the book Encountering the Book of Hebrews by Donald Hagner. And here's more information about it. So now I've got a potentially good resource to go back to if I want to do some more work on Hebrews. Going back to Heiser, let's see here. Taking a look at my notes. So we've seen the source. And Heiser continues to quote Hagner. And there's a misspelling there. That should be Hagner. So let's read the rest of this quote. Considerable debate about the meaning of the word hilasterion took place between C.H. Dodd, another scholar, who argued the word meant expiation, a removal of guilt of sin, and Leon Morris, who argued that it meant propitiation, the appeasing of the anger of God. The King James Version, the NASB translate the word as propitiation, and the RSV and NAB as expiation. Since both ideas are probably correct, one can do no better than to translate the word sacrifice of atonement, as do the NIV and the NRSV. The word in Hebrews 9:5, on the other hand, is best translated as place of atonement, and the NAB uses place of expiation. Okay. Lots of stuff going on there. So let's see. We're just going to follow along here to see what he's talking about. So if I go back over to Logos, and we're gonna take a look first at Romans 3:25. I've opened up a bunch of these Bibles already. What's nice about Logos is if you see I've got this little letter A here, this A here, A here. They are all linked. All these Bibles are linked together, so if I move to someplace in one of the Bibles, they're all going to move there. And we're going to go look for Romans 3:25. And in this place, we've got, in the King James Version, the word propitiation. And if I look at my interlinear, I got hilasterion here. The NASB says propitiation also. Same thing, hilasterion. The NIV, on the other hand, why did you not move to Romans 3:25? There. Scroll down a little bit. And we've got NIV says sacrifice of atonement for hilasterion. The NRSV 3:25. That also uses the word sacrifice atonement for hilasterion. Now I don't have in Logos, I don't have the NAB and the RSV. So if I go over to Bible Gateway, I can find those here, and I'll look up Romans 3:25 and NRSV, and here we see sacrifice of atonement, and then NAB was the other one, the New American Bible. I go there, and it uses the word expiation. So blah, blah, blah. We're going to look at those meanings here in a minute, but you can see what Hagner is describing here. Different scholars translate this Greek word hilasterion in different ways. They apply to it different interpretive meanings. So let's see, looking at my notes again here. And since we're studying our Bibles, we have to understand what these words mean. So let's do a quick Google search of, I just want to go to Google. And we'll look at expiation. So expiation is the act of making amends or reparation for guilt or wrongdoing. And then propitiation. So expiation. So if I'm guilty, if I've done a wrong to someone else, I'm making amends for that. That's what expiation is. And then propitiation, in this case, appeasing God. So I've got this angry spirit or God or a person, and I've got to appease them somehow. That's what propitiation means. Working backwards from the meaning of the Greek word, we see that our scholars aren't actually sure. These New Testament scholars aren't sure. What does it actually mean? Is it propitiation? Is it expiation? Do we not know? So we'll just call it sacrifice, or sacrifice of atonement, and hope the reader interprets it correctly for themselves. And this disagreement is very clear because the different Bible translations they exist. They exist because these scholars can't totally figure it out. We'll do a quick look at Hebrews 9 verse 5, because what's interesting there, same Greek word, it's totally different interpretation across the board. So here we have mercy seat, where in the Romans passage it meant propitiation or expiation. Here they're just saying mercy seat. And if I go to the NIV, atonement cover, which that same thing, it's the cover of the ark. Hilasterion, NASB, mercy seat, Hilasterion, King James Version. So you get the point. And it's translated, it's not really interpreted as much as it's just translated to this mercy seat thing, this atonement cover. Except for the NAB, which does a little bit of interpreting. We'll go back here to, and in this case, it says the place of expiation. So it's trying to do a little bit of interpretive work there, where the others just leave it as a mercy seat. Now, what's interesting at times like this, we've got these New Testament scholars who are differing from one another on what this term means, how to apply it, that sort of thing. And here we are, just general Bible students, and we've got this advantage over the scholar. We're not married to a conclusion. Our next paycheck doesn't come from what we believe or what we publish. Our career doesn't depend on knowing one Bible book or topic in depth. We can study anything we want from any perspective and follow any rabbit trail. And this is where it begins to get good. So I'm going to go back to Mike Heiser for a minute. He reads this, and I love this in the transcript. He goes on to say, I don't really like any of that. And then he explains it a little bit. But I read it because it's common. You may have come across this discussion, but it really reflects a New Testament perspective. New Testament scholars who are working in Greek and the Septuagint They're not going back to the Akkadian and hey, what does this term actually mean in its ancient Near Eastern context? And when we've got access, as me again, when we have access to the resources that we can work from the source and move forward instead of working backwards from the later translations, some interesting things can happen. And Heiser begins to point this out. So I'm going to continue quoting Heiser here because I love what he says. And we'll dive into this a little bit. So I would say, so I'm starting here in the middle and reading down. So I would say if you go with the Old Testament meaning of the verb from this Akkadian root, it doesn't mean either expiation, the removal of guilt, because the blood isn't applied to anybody in the Day of Atonement ritual anyway. And it really doesn't mean propitiation, like appeasing the anger of God. There's no anger dealt with in Leviticus 16. These ideas are imported because of terms like expiation and propitiation. Scholars are trying to figure out what a Greek term means, as opposed to going back and saying, look, it means purge, it means to decontaminate. So I would say, if you go to the Old Testament, and this is me reading it down here, if you go to the Old Testament meaning of the verb in its own context in the ancient Near East, I think we can approach it a little bit differently. And I'm willing to say a little bit better. The point of its use, I think, in Romans and here in Hebrews 9:5 would be that Christ's blood provides access to God's presence. The relationship is restored. It's not under threat of ruination as the year goes by, so that it needs resetting every year. Rather, the relationship between sinner and God is permanently healed through Christ. In other words, the access to God is permanently provided. We don't have to worry about the access being contaminated again, just like you did with the Old Testament system. You had to have this reset button event to have things go back to their setting point, back to their original point, and then we essentially start over again. So if we follow this, it's me now. So if we follow the Day of Atonement requirements from Leviticus 16, which is what Hebrews 9 is all about, we get an entirely different understanding. Because we're working from the source and proceeding forward, we see there's no angry God who needs appeasing, so it's not propitiation. And we see that none of the blood of the goat sacrificed as a sin offering is sprinkled on a person. In fact, Hebrews 9 says there's no forgiveness of sin without the shedding of blood. And in Leviticus 16, the goat offered for the people's sin isn't even killed. It's set free to wander into the desert. So it's also not expiation. The priest is not making amends for anyone's wrongdoing or anyone's guilt. So then what is it? Our previous study mentions that the sprinkling of blood because of the people's sin is a process of decontamination, a reset button, so to speak, that Heiser references. And that allows a measure of proximity to God in a sacred space. And when you read Leviticus 6:16 using the idea of purification or decontamination where the word atonement is used, the whole chapter makes sense. So let's see. Let's take a look at Leviticus. We'll go back over to Logos. And I guess we're in chapter 16 here. So I'll go to the top of chapter 16. And in verse 5, so we'll take a look at verse 5 here. And he shall take from the congregation of the people of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering, and 1 ram for a burnt offering. So he's got these 2 goats for a sin offering. And then in verses 8 through 10, starting here, and Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord, and the other lot for Azazel. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord, and use it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord, to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. I don't know. So in verse 8 through 10, one of the goats is a sin offering, the other is a scapegoat left to wander in the wilderness. You know, if I'm not digging at all, it sure sounds like this is an offering for forgiveness of sins. It's easy to gloss over, but really understanding this is going to require some careful reading. We can't just stop there. So I'm going to scroll down to verse 14 in Leviticus 16. We see what happens. In verse 14 here, and he, Aaron, shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat and on the east side. And in front of the mercy seat he shall sprinkle some of the blood with his finger 7 times. So this is the offering on behalf of the high priest on and around the mercy seat. And in verse 15 he sprinkles the blood of the first goat. So we'll continue in verse 15. Then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering that is for the people, and bring its blood inside the veil, and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it over the mercy seat and in front of the mercy seat. So he's doing this on behalf of the people on and around the mercy seat. And earlier I asked, what's being atoned for? What's being atoned and for what purpose? And if we continue on to verse 16, we get an explanation. Thus, he, Aaron, shall make atonement for the holy place. So that's what's being atoned for, the holy place. Because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel, and because of all their transgressions, all their sins. And so he, Aaron, shall do for the tent of meeting, which dwells with them in the midst of their uncleanness. So it's dirty, it's unclean, it's not pure, it's impure. There's a problem here. And the place where God sits literally on this mercy seat is being atoned for because of all of these impurities of the people. What do you do when something's impure? You purify it. You decontaminate it. And this is done so that God can continue in their presence. So what happens with the actual sin of the people if this blood is not purifying, if this blood is not forgiving their sin? And that's dealt with in verses 20 through 22. So we start reading here in verse 20. And when he, Aaron, has made an end of atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar. So these are spaces, these are places, these are physical objects that are being atoned for. He shall present the live goat. And Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel, and all their transgressions, all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. The goat shall bear all their iniquities on itself to a remote area, and he shall let the goat go free into the wilderness. So again, it's what's going on with the sin. It's not forgiveness as we know it. There's nothing here that talks about dealing with our conscience before God. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but the sin is acknowledged through this scapegoat that's not killed, but it's left to wander in the desert. If we contrast that with Hebrews 9, especially verse 22 and 23, so let me go there real quick. Hebrews 9:22. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. There's no forgiving there. It's purified. And without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins. So we've got this goat with all the sins of the people being left to wander in the desert. Its blood was not shed. But here in Hebrews 9, we see unless that blood is shed, there's no forgiveness of sins. So whatever's going on here, it's not forgiveness the way we think about it. We see this purification, not necessarily forgiveness going on in Hebrews 9. The author's clear that these offerings don't deal with the guilt or the conscience of a person. So his use of forgiveness in the sense of the Day of Atonement sacrifices is more about purifying the sacred space and allowing people to come into proximity with God. So when in our Hebrew study we've said, anyway, sorry, full stop there. That's the detail of what's going on here. So if we take a step back, and in our Hebrews study, we've said a number of times the ideas that the author of Hebrews raises are in the heads of this Jewish Christian audience who's reading his words. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. They would understand this Day of Atonement thinking. It's a big deal. It's a 1 day a year thing for the Jewish people. It's like the 4th of July in the United States. Independent about what you think of United States history, we all know what the 4th of July is. It's part of our heritage. And without us doing this kind of work to know what's in the minds of both the author of Hebrews and his intended audience, it's really 50-50 on whether we get the interpretation or application right. And even that's more a matter of luck than correctness. The New Testament doesn't stand on its own. It's an interpretation of the Old Testament, and we need to know that in order to get it right. So I suggest maybe you take 15 minutes and read Leviticus 16 slowly. Picture in your mind the different scenes as they play out, and you'll see this idea of purification and be able to leverage it to accurately interpret Hebrews 9.